Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to talk about scope. So the scope of a variable basically refers to the range of code over which a variable can be used or can be accessed. Now, for the purposes of where we are at in this class right now, you can kind of categorize the scope of variables into two general categories. So one of those categories is a local variable, and this basically refers to a variable that has a scope that's only visible within one function. So if you declare a variable or declare a variable in a function, or even have a parameter variable for a function, that would be considered a local variable. Now the other category of variables would be a global variable. So this would be variables that are all the way unindented and that basically are not inside of a function. And these can potentially be used in multiple functions in one file. Now you may have to use this special global keyword to get that to work, but I'll show you that global keyword a little bit later. So scope can get a little bit more complicated once you get to learning about classes in Python. But for the time being, given the level that, that we're at in this course, you can just think about things in these two categories for now. Later on, you can increase your understanding of scope. So take a look at this code here. So this is a modified version of a program to calculate waiter earnings. So what has been changed is there's actually been a function calculate that has the while loop that actually repeatedly asks the user for input, and so on. So what I want you to do is look at this code. Some of it is in a function, some of it is not in a function, and I want you to tell me how many global variables you think are in this code. So, number of global variables. Well, if you do the counting, there are 5 global variables. So one is declared there, one there, and there's actually 2 that are created there because the calculate function was designed to return 2 values, the total pay and the total hours, and so 2 get created there. So these are considered global because, well, in this case, they're not in a function and they're global variables. But let's ask the other side of the question, which is, in this same code, how many local variables are there? Well, the answer to this is actually also 5. So a local variable would be one that's scope, its usable range, is limited to one function. And so in this case, we have 5 of those in the calculate function, 3 there, and 2 there within the loop. Now, when we talk about scope, the scope basically indicates where a variable is usable. So for example, the index variable, this is a variable that can be used inside of this function, but if I tried to print out index down here, it would actually not work. It would fail because that I variable was declared in calculate. It's a local variable to calculate, cannot be accessed out here in the global scope. So let's do a few examples. I'm going to walk through several examples or run several examples, and I'm going to, hopefully by going through these, it kind of gets you thinking a little bit more about the difference between global and local, and so let's jump into those. So take a look at this code here. We have a name variable, a global one that's declared, and then there's a function, process name. That function is called, and then we print out name. And so for this example, there's an input, and several of the other ones, there's an input that it requests. And so for these, let's use the example Jacob, but take note with how this is, the lowercase at the beginning and then uppercase letters after that. So what would this print out for that input? So for this input, let's think about it. We have this global variable, the function definition, and then it would call process name. So we go up and call process name, and it asks for a name. So if that's what is typed in, that's what this name variable becomes. But the question is, does this overwrite this variable, or is this a separate name variable? Well, let's see. So we grab the first letter, and then with a slice, we grab the remaining letters, and then we convert that first letter to upper, the rest of the letters to lower, concatenate them, and put them into name. So presumably at that point, this name variable would be the correctly capitalized Jacob. So then the function would return, and we'd go down here and print. But again, the question is this name the same as this name? And when we go to run this, you will be able to tell, if you're following along closely, that it still just prints out NAME. So this global variable name is, in this case, the way that this code is written, that name variable is different, or it's a different variable and it's in a different scope than that global variable. So I can have this name variable in there, and if I print name in there, it would print out the correctly capitalized Jacob, but by the time we return and get back to the global scope, name still has that global name variable. So it's actually possible at a particular point when you're within a function to have a local variable with a particular name, but then outside of your scope or in the global scope, there's a variable with the same name as well. So you've got to keep track of that. All right, let's go back to the slides. And so notice the change that I'm going to make to this code. Pay attention. So just look at that. What would this print out instead? Well, I actually kind of just showed you something similar to this because I had showed you what happens if we print out a name there. But let's try it just to be sure. So if I say Jacob, it prints out the correctly capitalized Jacob. So, right, just that difference in scope, you got to keep that in mind. Now, another change. So pay close attention. So now there's a process name function. Well, I guess I should say there's still a process name function, and this time it actually has a parameter. So we ask for input from the user, we pass in a name, do some processing, and return, and then print. So what will this print out for that same input there? So for this one, let's go ahead and just run it. And why do I have extra spaces? So we run, we type in Jacob, and it prints out the still incorrectly capitalized version. So why is that? Well, we get that input, we call the function, name to process, gets assigned to the incorrect version, and we do the work of capitalization, but name is just a local variable in this case, and it does not override this global one. So by the time we return and get back here, Jacob is still that same original string that we gave as input. All right, a few more. So for this one, take a look at this. So what I've done is notice the difference between that and that is I'm actually assigning the result of this to the parameter. Does this affect anything? Will this affect the outside world at all? What do you think? All right, so we try this out. Let me just, I'll just change it in the code editor, name to process. And I run this, and it still just prints out lowercase j, uppercase A, C, O, B. So when you're in a function and you assign something to a parameter like this, in this way, at least, So you assign something like this, that does change what the parameter variable is, but it doesn't change what the name variable is in the outside world. So if we later on, went to print out in the function, we went to print out name to process, we would still just get, we would get the correctly formatted Jacob, but outside world still has the incorrect one. All right, a few more, and then we will wrap up. So notice the change here. So now I'm returning the result of this capitalization and saving the return value into the name variable. What will this print? Okay, so if you've been following along, if you're processing how returns work and how the scope is working, hopefully you're able to actually get these. So run, Jacob, and it's the correctly capitalized version. And that's because we actually return the value we create, and when you return it, we then override the original value that we got and print that value out. Okay, so at the end here, I have a return problem that you can go do on your own time if you're interested in it. But let's do one more of these scope examples, or Jacob scope examples. So this code here, we let me compare it to the last one, right? So process name, we still have a process name. I want you to take a close look at this and tell me what you think is going to happen on this one. All right, so this one, rather than printing out Jacob, actually, when we run it, generates an error. Unbound local error, local variable name referenced before assignment. So what is going on here? Well, we have our global name variable, and then we call this. And what you might think here is, well, okay, so we're trying to get the first letter of our input that we got up here, and then we're trying to get the rest of them and do the capitalization. So why does it say unbound local error? Why can't Python just figure out, well, there's a global variable called name, so go use that global variable. That's what I want to use here. Well, it doesn't just know that by default. When you do this, it's going to look for a local variable declared within your function with that name. And in this case, it doesn't find one, so it gives you this error. It says that the variable is referenced before assignment. So you're trying to use it before you've actually told Python what it is, even though you kind of already did because it's in the global scope. So what you have to do in cases like this, if you have a global variable, but you want to be able to use it in this way inside of a local function, you can do that, but you just have to give Python a little extra information. There's a keyword called global, and if after that keyword, if you put whatever the name of your variable is that's global, this basically indicates to Python, when I use the name variable in this function, use the global version of this, not, don't try and just look for this locally. So if I run this now, it actually prints out the correctly capitalized version, because even this right at that point, since I have told it to use the global name, now that line can actually overwrite the global value, and we can print it out on line 11. So hopefully that wasn't too dry or too boring, but a bunch of examples there to kind of get your brain really thinking through what's going on with the local, what's going on at the global level, and can I affect the global level from the local level, and so on. So if you have further questions about scope, you don't have to be scope experts, but you really should be familiar with kind of the difference between a local and a global variable, especially with the rule about styling your programs and how you should have most of your code within a function. So keep this in mind when you're designing your code. Now here's another problem that I won't go through in detail, but if you want to take this and kind of use this as some practice and figure out what this is going to print out, you're welcome to do so. But I think I will pause the video at this point. So have a good one, everybody, and stay tuned for the next videos.